We have Andrew Solomon here with his noonday demons on depression, and we have Madhu Trehan introducing him. I request everyone to make sure that there's no flash photography while the session is on, and please switch off your cell phones. If you receive a call, please don't accept it and don't have a conversation while the session is on. Thank you so much.
I'm really delighted, happy and excited to introduce Andrew Solomon. We were in a session before which was, to me, riveting and exciting and emotional. Today he's going to talk about a book that was made the final list for the Pulitzer Prize and also got the National Book Award for Non-Fiction and the Lambda Literary Award for Autobiography or Memoir. This book is about a subject that in India is still not talked about openly. We generally sweep this kind of problem under the carpet. If we have it ourselves, we're afraid to talk about it. And it's about depression. It's called The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression, is a memoir written by Andrew Solomon. He examines the personal, cultural, and scientific aspects of depression through interviews with depression sufferers, doctors, research scientists, politicians, and pharmaceutical researchers. It is an outgrowth of Solomon's 1998 New Yorker article on depression. I hope you find it illuminating. I'm sure you will, and we're expecting a lot of questions afterwards. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks to all of you for coming. I assume you all know that I'm not Philip Hensher, and I'm rather filling in for Philip Hensher, who was unable to make it to the festival. And the topic is depression, and I published my book in 2001, but have remained attentive to that field. And when I set out to write the book, I was essentially interested in addressing what I saw as three questions or problems or issues. The first is that in the world of depression, at least in the English language, there was an enormous number of memoirs that people had written, many of which were very stirring, but they were very personal and very narrowly specific. And then there were cultural commentaries, and then there was scientific material. And all of them were of interest, but they weren't very much connected to one another. And I experienced a sort of chaos in the kingdom. And I wanted to bring some sort of order back by indicating that, in fact, depression encompasses the cultural, the social, the economic, the political, to look at all of the areas in which it functions and to try to come up with a kind of unified field theory. So, and then as I started working on the book, I wanted to address a common problem in the parlance of the US, but also I think of much of the world, which is the idea that depression is a modern, Western, middle-class illness. I wanted to look at how depression has functioned in a variety of contexts and to demonstrate that it exists across class, across history, and across cultures. The thing that became most interesting as I continued to work on the book, however, was that I found that there were some people who had what they described really as relatively minor depression, with symptoms that didn't sound so acute, who were nonetheless completely and utterly disabled by it and paralyzed. And I met other people who had what sounded in description like much more acute depression, but who nonetheless had rather rich and rewarding lives in the interstices between their severe episodes. And in looking at those experiences, I became interested in the relationship between personality and illness, and wanted to examine what the mechanisms are of resilience, why it is that some people who suffer from depression are destroyed by it, and some are not. Of course, as I went forward, I then also wanted to look at what people's experiences were, and so I interviewed many, many people about their own experience of depression, and got their narratives of what they had experienced. And of course, I wanted to look at what the treatments are for depression. When is psychotherapy appropriate? When is medication appropriate? When should they be used together? If they're used together, how? And what are the alternative treatments that are out there beyond medication and psychotherapy? So that was sort of my jumping off point. And the basis for my expertise was that I had experienced a terrible depression. In fact, I experienced repeated depressions, and so I was speaking out of my own experience of it. And I had found when I spoke to people as I went along that there were many people who had relatives who were suffering from depression and they didn't understand what it was. And it's a poverty of the English language. I don't know whether it's true of Hindi or other languages in India, but it's a poverty of English and of many European languages that we have the same word to describe how a little child feels when his ball game is cancelled because of the rain. Oh, he's just a little depressed about that. And a severe mental illness that leads many people to kill themselves. And from that poverty of language, we have the problem that we can't really identify the clear boundaries of what constitutes depression. It's something that exists on a continuum with ordinary sadness, and yet it isn't sadness. It's a feeling of a kind of nullity. I say sometimes that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality, and that vitality is the thing that disappears when someone is going through a depression. So in 1991, my mother died, and in 1994, I published a novel in which I sort of reworked the story of my mother's illness and death. And then I published that novel, and I went into a catastrophic depression. Now, in retrospect, I think I'd had minor depressions earlier than that. Depression is, for most people who experience it, a cyclical illness. You have an episode, and then another episode, and then another episode. They tend to take place one after the next, and they tend to be free-floating. But a lot of people who suffer from severe depression describe a moment when they suddenly became aware of themselves as having this serious condition. And for me, it was that time in 1994 when the novel was being published. And the first thing I remember is that I sort of lost interest in a lot of things. I would think, well, I might go out and do something today, but maybe I'll just stay home in bed instead. And the novel was receiving fairly good reviews, and I had always dreamed of publishing a novel. And I thought, gee, I really should be excited about this, but actually, I don't care what anyone has said about the writing, or about me, or really about anything else. And so I settled into a kind of sense of disconnectedness from everything. And then after the disconnectedness came the period of effort, when everything began to seem unfathomably and unreasonably difficult. I can remember getting up and thinking, I should eat lunch. But thinking, but if I'm going to eat lunch, I'd have to get the food out and put it on a plate and cut it up and put it in my mouth and chew it and swallow it. And it seemed like those were the stations of the cross. It seemed like torture, the idea of having to do all those things. I would get messages on my answering machine, and instead of thinking, oh, how nice to hear from my friends, I would think, how am I ever going to call all of those people back? I was overwhelmed and overwhelmed and overwhelmed again. And then the anxiety element set in. Anxiety and depression tend to occur together, and the anxiety was a feeling of incredible fear with no particular object. So that I felt all the time the way that you might feel if you slip and trip and you're about to hit the ground. You have that moment of terror. And it was like that, except that instead of lasting for a second and a half, it lasted day after day after day. And I really think if someone said to me, you have to be depressed, but it will only last a month, I wouldn't be pleased, but I would say, okay, if it's only a month, that's fine. But if someone said you have to experience acute anxiety without treatment for a month, I would say there's no way that I can do it, because the feeling was sort of so awful, and I began to be afraid of going out, and then I began to be afraid even of getting up. And then finally there came a day when I woke up, and I thought, I can't move. I thought I might have had a stroke because I felt so paralyzed, and I thought, what am I to do in the face of this pain? And I thought I should call someone for help. And there was a telephone next to my bed, and I lay there for 4 hours staring at the telephone and trying to muster the courage to reach out and pick it up, and I simply couldn't do it. And at the end of 4 hours, the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was my father. And he said, how are you? And I said, something has gone very wrong. I said, can you come down here and get me? So he came downtown to get me. And I should emphasize that through this period, I actually had been seeing a psychotherapist, as many people do in the United States, and especially in New York, who had kept telling me that it was brave and courageous of me to try to fight this depression without medication. And so I had not taken any medication. It was only at that point when I was really completely unable to move that I finally consented to see a psychopharmacologist. And I find that people often say about medication, they say, but I know why I'm depressed. There's a reason for my depression, and so medication isn't appropriate to me. And I often say in response that if you fall off a ladder and break your arm, there's a reason why you broke your arm, but it's still worth getting the bones set. I'm going to read to you some descriptions from some of the people I interviewed, what they had to say about their own experience of depression. This is from someone named Laura Anderson. I wrote an article for the New Yorker about depression and afterwards got a huge amount of correspondence. And Laura is someone who became a friend and with whom I had constant interaction. And she had had a very severe depression, was okay when she wrote to me, and then responded via emails, and we ended up being in almost daily contact for a while. So this, from page 95 of the book, is from when she was escalating into a depression. She wrote to me one day, "I'm not yet in a full-blown depression, but I'm slowing down a little. I mean that I have to focus on each thing I do on more and more levels. I'm not completely depressed at this point, but I have entered a recession." And then a few days later, "I only take baths now because the water beating down on me from the shower is too much to deal with in the morning and seems these days like a violent way to begin the day." That feeling over and over again that one is being somehow assaulted. A week later, she wrote to me, "I looked at old photos today, and they seemed like they're snapshots of someone else's life." And then finally she wrote, "My mood continues to be grim, morning terror and abject helplessness by late afternoon. My boyfriend wanted to take me to the park. He brought a pamphlet identifying all the plants. By the description of one tree it said, 'All parts deadly poisonous.' I thought maybe I could find the tree, chew on a leaf or two, and curl up under a rock ledge and drift off. Depression takes away whatever I really, really like about myself, which is not so much in the first place. I try to work through these large blocks of horror in the meantime. I can see why they call it mean." One of the things that you often don't hear about in relation to depression is that when you're in a depression, you actually generally know that it's a ludicrous state. You know that it's ridiculous. You think to yourself, okay, other people make lunch, they make it every day, they make it without thinking of it. Other people take showers and they do fine. And you keep thinking, it doesn't make any sense that I can't eat lunch or that I can't take a shower. It just doesn't make any sense that I can't do these things. And yet, even as you find it incomprehensible, you know that it's actually true and that there is no alternative to the frozenness in which you're sitting. And it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to feel that you can't do the things everyone else does and that you yourself could do not a very long time before. So that's an endless stress and tension, I think, for people. Then there's the question of medication and therapy, which are so often held up as if they were opposites, and the world of alternative treatments. And in fact, it seems to me that medications and therapy, with which I have the most experience, supplement each other. For me, if I hadn't gone on that medication, I wouldn't have been able to stand up. I was so physically paralyzed, and I forget how physical it is when I'm not depressed. And when I have an occasional mild episode, and I had one quite recently because of a medical problem that I had, I'm reminded of how the whole center of my body seems to be changed, and of how physically painful it is to be in that state, and how hard it is to get from minute to minute. But while the medication got me to the point where I was no longer in that physical paralysis, I then had to make sense of myself. I had to make sense of myself as someone who took medication. I had to make sense of myself as someone who had actually had sadness so epidemic that it paralyzed me. I had to think about how I would deal with it if it came again. And for all of those things, it was very helpful to me to have some form of therapy. I'll read you just a brief description from someone else who had serious depression. One of my closest friends, the first serious depression I ever witnessed, she has bipolar illness, and she had mania and then depression when we were still university students. And then a little while after that, she finally got on medications, and she did very well for 11 years. And then she had a therapist who said, "Well, you've done so well for all of this time, why don't we try taking you off medication?" To It's never a good idea for anyone who has been significantly helped by it, but particularly not for people with bipolar illness. And this business of there being a kind of heroism in getting off of medication, as though somehow we're getting brownie points with the powers that be, seems to haunt an enormous number of people who grapple with depression. And I think it's rooted in a fiction, because while the medication has side effects that some people may resist, and that they may therefore wish to avoid, the idea that the medication itself is a sign of weakness is misguided, I think. It takes quite a lot of courage to decide to take medication. It takes a lot of courage to enter into that experiment with your own brain, and the people who do so are hardly being cowardly in doing it. And while the medication doesn't appear to have long-term significant negative effects on the brain, there's no question that repeated depressive episodes do have long-term negative significant effects on the brain. And there's a real imperative, I think, therefore, for people not to put themselves through repeated episodes if they don't have to. There are some people for whom the medication doesn't work, and some people for whom the side effects are intolerable. But a lot of the time, your first depression is triggered by something, but by the time you're on your fourth or your fifth, they just come out of nowhere. This is from Maggie's description of the depression in which I saw her after she'd come off her medication, which was as profound as any I've seen. She said, "I would lie in bed singing, 'Where have all the flowers gone?' over and over to occupy my mind. I realize now that I could have had some other drugs, or that I could have asked someone to come and sleep in my room, but I was just too sick to think of that. I couldn't say what scared me so much, but I thought I would explode from the anxiety. I just went down and down and down and down. We kept changing medications, and I just kept going further down. I believed my doctors. I always accepted that I would eventually come back to normal, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't even do the next minute. I was singing to blot out the things my mind said, which were, you don't even deserve to live. You are worthless. You are never going to be anything. You're nobody." And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. You try to pin the truth down and take it apart, and you think that truth is a fixed thing, but the truth is alive and it runs around. You can exorcise the demons of schizophrenics who perceive that there's something inside them, but it's much harder with depressed people, because we believe we are seeing the truth, but the truth lies. I'm going to address in that moment that idea that the truth can lie. One of the things one notes in dealing with people with severe depression is that they make two categories of statements. They make statements which are untrue. Someone says, "Nobody loves me," and you say, "Of course they do. You know your father loves you." They say, "I don't know what to do with myself," and you say, "Well, you were doing all these things before that were very satisfactory." But people who are depressed also say things such as, "No matter what any of us does, we're all just going to die," or "Every one of us is isolated inside his own body, and there can be no real communion with anyone else." And those statements are really true, and what you have to say in the face of them is, "I agree with you entirely, but now we should focus on what you'd like to have for dinner." And what seems stupefying, in fact, is that there are so many people who deal with depression, and who don't deal with depression, who manage not to be laid low by those existential questions which are really so urgent. And the reality is that seeing incredibly clearly is not an advantage. We all need to see somewhat clearly. People who don't see clearly at all destroy themselves, but too much clarity is actually very dangerous. So I was interested by a study that was done in which a group of depressed and non-depressed people were asked to play a video game for an hour. And at the end of the hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. The depressed people were usually right to within about 10%. The non-depressed people guessed between 8 and 12 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. So it was this extraordinary, you're not depressed, you see things as better than they are. That seeing of things as better than they are is a necessary armor that every depressed person seems to lose. And so when you say to depressed people, it would be better if you didn't see truly, some of them resist that idea. It's difficult to know how essential the process is. One of the things also about depression is that it's incredibly ubiquitous. There are so many people who are grappling with it, and often people who are grappling with it don't realize how many other people are grappling with it because the stigma results in so much secrecy. And that secrecy itself can be toxic. It's exhausting to be depressed. It's exhausting to keep secrets. Dealing with both of those things at the same time is unbelievably draining and unbelievably exhausting, and frequently very counterproductive. People kept saying to me, "You wrote this book and you admitted to what you've been through with depression and treatments and so on." They said, "Did you feel people were laughing at you?" And I said, "There may have been some people who were laughing at me, but my primary experience has been thousands and thousands and thousands of people who write to me or talk to me and say, this is what I've been going through, this is what I've done." As someone I interviewed once said, it's the family secret that every family has somewhere within the family. And I was at a conference a few years ago in England, and on Friday, it was a weekend-long conference, and on Friday, one of the participants said, "Can I just talk to you for a few minutes?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I know you wrote this book about depression. I have depression. I'm currently taking medication. I wanted your advice. Do you think this is right? Do you think that's right?" So I gave her whatever advice I could, and then she said to me, "I'd just like to say, though, that I don't discuss this with my husband. I don't think he could ever understand it, and so please don't say anything to him. He's also here this weekend." So I said that was fine. On Sunday, her husband took me aside, and he said to me, "Please don't tell my wife because she wouldn't think I was a real guy, but I'm just taking this medication," and they were hiding, each of them, the same medication in 2 different places in the same room. So I felt like communication in the marriage might be implicated in their depression. But I nonetheless just saw how burdensome that secrecy was. When I started out to write this book, I had a strong sense that there were really 2 treatments that worked, which were psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral or psychoanalytically based, and medication. And I was very focused on the way of getting everyone to pay attention to those things. And then as I worked on the book, which, as I say, was some time ago, and it was a process that changed for me. I was a lot younger then. I realized that there were many, many, many different kinds of treatments that could work for people, including treatments based in meditation, including treatments that were based in various kinds of traditional medicine, including other and more radical medical treatments. And among the most important work that's been done on depression since I finished the book is the work of a scientist named Helen Mayberg, who's done something called deep brain stimulation, in which she puts an electrode in something called area 25 in the brain, and she connects it to a battery, and the battery continues to stimulate that area, regulates its metabolism, and she's had miraculous results with people. She only works on people who failed all other treatments and who are permanently hospitalized with depression. And a good 60% of those patients improve on the treatment that she has. So the possibility of advances in science is enormous. Now, most depressed people are not going to want to have an electrode placed in their brain if they don't have to. But the idea that we've identified this previously unidentified area and shown how it regulates emotion suggests that there may be other ways of addressing that, either through medication or even through some kind of talk therapy. And I should emphasize that in many cases, if you have people who just do medication or just do talk therapy and you scan their brains, it appears that you have very similar physiological shifts in their brains. So there really is a lot of overlap between the 2 modes. Before Helen's work, there was a protocol developed called a cingulotomy, which had a very uneven track record but worked for some people. And I'm going to tell you about a guy named Russakoff who went and had a cingulotomy. It's a procedure in which a hole is drilled through the skull and a lesion is burned into the brain, and it sometimes alters the way that the brain functions. And when I met him, before he had the cingulotomy, he was coming out of a period in which he had, for many years, been so depressed that he would go through a week of feeling horrific, would check into a hospital where he would receive electroconvulsive therapy, which is a very effective, though not enormously pleasant, intervention for depression. Then he would have a week in which he felt sort of okay, then a week in which he felt bad, and then he would be back in the hospital again. So he was constantly there. And he said to me, "I have a plan for how to end my life if this next thing doesn't work." And yet I thought, where did the optimism come to try something else? He's tried 20 different interventions, and none of them has really worked. And now here he is getting ready to go in for brain surgery. And even though his situation was in many ways characterized by despair, it struck me that it also was invested with an enormous amount of hope. When I met him, he was pale and sweaty and thin and unhappy. And a year after the cingulotomy, he was doing miraculously well and his life was transformed. And he wrote me a letter that year at Christmas, and I'm just going to read you a few minutes from it. My dad gave me 2 presents this year: a motorized CD rack that's totally unnecessary and extravagant, but that he knew I'd get a kick out of, and a photo of my grandmother who committed suicide. As I opened the present, I began to cry. My mom came over to the chair and asked if I were crying because of all the relatives I never knew. And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying now as I write to you. It's not that I'm so sad. I just get overwhelmed. Maybe it's that I could have killed myself but didn't because those around me convinced me to keep going. And I had the surgery. I'm alive and grateful to my parents and some doctors. We live in the right time, even if it doesn't always feel like it. And I want to stress that idea of living in the right time. The techniques we have for treating depression are more advanced than they've ever been. It's my sincere hope that in 50 years people will think that that's the right time because these treatments will have advanced and become more powerful and will be more effective for the people who receive them and will have fewer and fewer side effects. But there is no question that the life that I am leading now wouldn't perhaps have been possible before the advances in medication and psychotherapy. And I think of the paralysis in which I might have lived with feelings of such horror, and think about the progress with feelings of such tremendous gratitude. I said I was going to look at alternative treatments. At one end, we have someone choosing to have an invasive form of brain surgery. The other end, I became very interested in tribal practices for the treatment of depression in West Africa. And I went to Senegal because I wanted to write about a ritual called the Undop, which is conducted for the treatment of severe mental illnesses. And I had a friend who was living there, and he had a Senegalese girlfriend, and she had a cousin who knew someone who had once been the auntie of somebody else, who whole line of connections back to someone who actually performed the Undop. And so we went off and I interviewed this woman, Madame Diouf, about her experience in conducting the Undop. And after we had finished having a long and very illuminating conversation, I said to her, well, I said, can I actually witness an Undop being performed? And she said, well, I've never had a foreigner present at one before, but yes, if you would like to, you may come. And I said, oh good, I said, that would be terrific. And I said, when will you next be doing one? And she said, well, sometime in the next 6 months, whenever someone needs one. And I said, 6 months is quite a long time for me to stay here, waiting for someone to require treatment. I said, is there any way to expedite it and make this happen a little bit faster? And she said, no, there really isn't. And I said, well, okay, thank you. And we were just leaving, and she said, excuse me, she said, and I said, what is it? And she said, you don't look so great yourself. And I said, oh. And she said, I've certainly never done this for a foreigner before, but I could do it Undop for you if you would like. And I said, sure, yes, let's try that. And we walked out, and Hélène, my friend's girlfriend, said to me, are you completely crazy? And I said, well, I guess that's what the ritual is supposed to be about. So I won't take you through all of the details, but I will tell you that the high point came when I was in the central square of this small town in a makeshift wedding bed with a ram, and I was wearing only a loincloth, and we were having pieces of cloth thrown over us as the entire village danced around us in concentric circles, and a drum was played. And then at a certain key moment, I was yanked to my feet, the throat of the ram was slit, and I was covered in the blood of the freshly slaughtered ram. And I thought this is a departure from psychotherapy as it's practiced on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But I talked to many people who had had an Undop and who said how powerful an experience it had been. And some years later, I was in Rwanda working on a later book, and I met with someone, and the story of the Undop came up, and I described the whole thing. And the person said to me, you know, in Rwanda, he said, we had a big problem after the genocide with some of the Western aid workers who came. And I said, really, what was that? And he said, well, he said, they didn't, I mean, we don't have a ritual much like the one you've described. He said, but some elements are common in the way that we've dealt with grief. He said, but these Western people came in and they didn't want to take people out into the bright sunshine where you begin to feel like yourself, and there wasn't music to get your blood flowing, and the community didn't come together around people. People were taken one at a time into dingy little rooms and asked to talk for an hour about bad things that had happened to them, which is the sort of American and European model of psychotherapy. And it was very illuminating for me to realize how provincial in some ways Western ideas of psychotherapy can be. It left me feeling very open to many, many different practices, and as I say, I found people who were extraordinarily helped, some of the time by things that seemed unlikely. I'm going to skip ahead and just talk a little bit about the issue of history and poverty. So this is from Hippocrates, writing 2,500 years ago. He said that depression, he didn't use that word, but he described a syndrome among his patients that included sadness, anxiety, moral dejection, tendencies to suicide, aversion to food, despondency, sleeplessness, irritability and restlessness accompanied by prolonged fear. If that's not a description of depression, I don't know what one would look like. And so that's been present, at least in many societies, probably in all societies, for thousands of years. But I also wanted to look at depression among the poor, which tends to be underdiagnosed. If you actually have a really wonderful life, but you feel miserable all the time, you tend to think there must be something wrong with you. And you think, oh, I have this problem, and perhaps I should do something about it, and you might seek help or treatment. If you have a life which is very bleak and terrible, and you feel terrible all the time, then the way you feel is commensurate with your life, and you're much less likely to go and seek treatment of any kind. So a lot of people who are poor don't identify themselves as having depression, because the way they feel about life seems appropriate. And yet, I found over and over again that people like this are not in a state of despair solely because their lives are awful, but have awful lives in part because they're in a state of intractable despair. And so I became very interested in a project which attempted to treat depression in impoverished populations. And I found a woman who was doing a pilot study in which she randomly screened women who came in through a birth control clinic near Washington, D.C., and then tried to assess them for depression and enrolled some of them in treatment. One of the women who I met, when I met her, was, she had 7 children. She had a very abusive husband who was constantly knocking her down. She was incredibly miserable. She could barely take care of herself. This is what she said at the time of her admission. I don't want to get out of bed, and I feel like there is no reason to do anything. I'm already small, and I'm losing more and more weight. I don't get up to eat or anything. I just don't care. Sometimes I sit and just cry, cry, cry. I have nothing to say to my own children. After they leave the house, I get in bed with the door locked. I fear when they come home 3 o'clock and it just comes so fast. My husband keeps telling me I'm stupid, I'm dumb, I'm ugly. I've been taking a lot of painkillers. It could be Tylenol or anything for pain. That's paracetamol. A lot of it, though, as anything I could get to put me to sleep. Well, a year later, after she had been through a protocol of treatment, she had left the abusive husband. She had gotten a job doing childcare for the US Navy, and I asked her how things were, and she said, my kids are so much happier. They want to do things all the time now. We talk hours every day, and they are my best friends. As soon as I come in the door, I put my jacket down, purse, and we just get out books and read, doing homework all together and everything. We joke around. The eldest wants to go to the Air Force, one wants to be a firefighter, one a preacher, and one of the girls is going to be a lawyer. There's one room in the new place for the boys, and one for the girls, and one for me. But they all just like to get up on my bed with me, and we're all sitting around there at night. That's all I need now is my kids. I never thought I would get this far. It feels so good to be happy, and things keep on changing. The way I dress, the way I look, the way I act, the way I feel. And if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I'd still be at home in bed if I was still alive at all. I prayed to the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayer. The level of transformation seemed extraordinary, and the level of transformation was not only clearly in our humanitarian interest, but also in our economic interest, because this was someone who had been contributing nothing effectively to the society, whose children had seemed headed toward the juvenile justice system, perhaps, and toward crime and dysfunction, and who was now taking good care of her own children. And I feel it's a matter of criminal neglect around the world, and certainly also in the US, that there aren't better programs for finding people who have these problems and providing them with help. I'm going to close by reading to you a little bit from what the people I told you about said later on after their depression. What I found, and it perhaps became for me the central finding of the book, is that some people have a depression and afterwards they want not to mention it or talk about it or think about it or have anyone else reference it or mention it. They want to put it behind them. And in putting it behind them, what they actually do is make themselves more vulnerable, because they're not prepared for it when it comes to ambush them again, as it almost inevitably will. And they don't have this clarity of thought that they need in order to get through. And they also have a disrupted sense of self, an unintegrated sense of self. What I found was that people who are able to say, okay, I would not have chosen this, and I would have done anything to avoid it, but having had it, there was something to be found in it that was of value. Those people ended up being the ones who did the best in the wake of it. And it was very moving to me to see how many people there were who had that experience and how much of a change it made for them. Frank Russakoff, who was the one who said that he had had the brain surgery, said, I'd say that I wish this had never happened, and I guess I do. But in fact, now that it has happened, I have to say, it made me closer to my parents, it made me closer to some doctors, it allowed me to see the good in humanity in a way I hadn't seen it before. Maggie, the one who said that the truth lies, said, I used to get nervous a lot, and I would just talk and talk. And then I started volunteering at an AIDS residence. They had teas there, and I was supposed to help get tea and cake and juice for the patients and to sit with them and chat, because many of them didn't have people to visit them and were lonely. I remember one day early on, I sat down with some people and tried to kick off a conversation, but they wouldn't make small talk. And then I realized it's going to be an occasion where I'm here with them and I'm going to be with them. I'm a person who doesn't have AIDS and doesn't look really sick and isn't dying, but I can tolerate the fact that they do, and they are. And so I just stayed with them that afternoon without talking. The loving is that you are there, simply paying attention, unconditionally. If suffering is what the person is doing right then, that's what they're doing. You're being with that, not trying like crazy to do something about it. I've learned how to do that. Our needs are our greatest assets. I guess I've learned to give all the things I need. And Laura Anderson said, depression has given me kindness and forgiveness where other people don't know enough to extend it. I am drawn toward people who might put off others with a wrong move or a misplaced barb. I had an argument about the death penalty tonight with someone, and I was trying to explain, without being too self-referential, that one can understand horrifying actions, understand the terrible links between mood and job and relationships and the rest of everything. I would never want depression to be a public or political excuse, but I think that once you have gone through it, you get a greater and more complete understanding of the temporary absence of judgment that makes people behave so badly. You learn even, perhaps, how to tolerate the evil in the world. When I think about my own depression, I feel as though it softened me, it made me a kinder person, I think it made me a better person, I think it gave me something to say, which has run through everything that I've written since that time. I also think, though, that it threw into relief the times of happiness, and that one's feeling of happiness sometimes has to do with the way in which the happiness represents a departure from what came before. And so I feel as though happiness within my own life has been sweeter, perhaps, than it would have been without that previous experience. So while I'm not saying that depressions are wonderful and you should all have one if you haven't yet, I'm not trying to sort of shill for them, I am nonetheless saying that I think that they play a key role. I began this book with the sentence, "Depression is the flaw in love." And what I meant by that was that if you loved someone but didn't mind when that person vanished or died, it wouldn't be love as we know it. The anticipation of that potential of loss is what makes one hold on so tight. And in a sense, if all of one's actual romantic love or one's love for one's children is imbued with that quality of anxiety and that sense of potential loss, if that's part of what constitutes intimacy, then having gone through so profound a depression may be part of what constitutes an intimacy with the world, which is something that I have learned to cherish. Thank you very much. To take some questions. So anyone who has questions and feels up to asking them? Someone in the front row, I think they're going to bring you a microphone. Yes, there you are.
Hi, thank you very much. I started reading this book last night, and I was amazed and honestly horrified because I haven't experienced this sort of thing myself. For someone who's lucky enough to be happy, like I am, going along having a good day, feeling lots of vitality, what do I look for in other people so I can be more aware and show kindness to them if that's needed? Beyond the bullet points that you sometimes hear about loss of interest in this day, what are some more refined clues that the rest of us can pick up on?
I think the clues that one picks up on to see where someone is depressed is a sense, first, if they're having lost joy in whatever the things are that seem as though they should cause them joy. Second, if they're having lost the feeling of volition, they're seeming not to understand that they have some power to make change in their own lives. And third, any form of social withdrawal. But I'm going to spin your question slightly and also answer another piece of it, which is that I'm frequently asked, what should someone do when someone they love is depressed? And often people who are depressed say to the people around them, I'd like you to leave me alone, and they push people away. But depression is a disease of loneliness, and if you really allow people who are depressed to become isolated, the chance that they will kill themselves or that they will settle into a darker and darker place is enormous. So I often say, okay, if you're dealing with someone who's depressed, perhaps they can't stand to have a conversation, so you need to just sit by the bed. And perhaps they can't even bear to have you in the room and you need to sit outside the door. But you need always to make it clear that you're not abandoning them. In a depression, people's sense of self-worth is radically diminished, and that often gives them the sense that no one could possibly love them. The proof that someone does is the most motivating thing there is to getting through the depression and coming out the other side. Anyone else? Yes? I think the...
Hi, thank you so much for that talk, it was beautiful. I would like to know how can society, are there any stories of cases where society has played a good role in rehabilitating the person back to a working scenario? Beyond the hospitals and the medication and the therapy, probably that period is a point where the person cannot work and he or she is dependent financially on relatives. So how has society helped integrate? Do you have examples of that from people?
Examples of how people go through the recovery process?
Especially becoming financially, during the various stages. Once they recover, it's probably easy for them to go back to jobs.
Right.
But during that phase of recovery, which might last, I'm guessing 6 months or a year, what do they do with themselves beyond just going to hospitals and therapy?
Well, this is the question, is how people who are depressed occupy themselves in the period before they can return to work and how they make it through that period. The difficult period is really the one in between. There's the period when someone has become acutely depressed, when relatives will sometimes say, well, let us take care of you. And that's the period when depression looks almost like grief, and often people tie it to something. I'm often asked to distinguish between depression and grief. Grief is a feeling of sadness caused by something. And while you may still be very sad a year after the event, you should be functioning better than you were when it happened. depression may be triggered by something bad that happens, but because it's depression and is given to escalating, you may very well feel even worse a year later than you did when the event took place and function even less well. The period when someone is going through the most acute phase is agony, but often people are sympathetic to it. The period when someone is back to functioning is a period in which often they're able to take care of themselves and everything is fine. The period in between is a very dangerous period when they're activated but not yet functioning well. It's a period in which I think an enormous number of suicides take place. It's a period in which people need an enormous amount of support. They need to have people around them. If it's possible for them to begin to do some work, that helps to rebuild their sense of self-worth. But it's not the acute period, which is always the worst. It's that in-between period that can be most terrifying, and there really isn't that much structure for it. The great thing is if the people around the person are able to recognize that they're going through a transition to something better, and to keep reminding the person himself of that. Because often you feel as though, well, I'm a little better than I was before, but I'm really not well, I'm never going to be well again. And that feeling that you will never be well again is part of the illness. If it's reflected in everyone else saying you'll never be well again, that will destroy you 100%. Thank you. Yes, the rank.
Hi, so as we talk about brain surgeries and psychotherapy and medication as though, well, not the only, but one of the forms of treating a person, I'm really interested to know, as wouldn't you want to explore or didn't it intrigue you enough to explore alternative therapy like color therapy, meditation for that matter? Did you go into that length of maybe including a page of that? Possibly, just curious.
Yes. So I did actually, I did do so, and that was when I said at the beginning there's a section on alternatives, there's a whole chapter on alternative treatment. And I, as I said, had this real process of going from being rather narrow-minded, I think, about alternative treatments to thinking that there was a great deal that could be accomplished through them. The difficulty is always to find which treatment is going to work for which person. I think a lot of the time when people have got the most severe acute depression, the medication is certainly the most efficient and sometimes the most effective way to treat them. But in terms of negotiating all the other milder depression, recurring depression and so on, I think that meditative practices in particular can bring about really extraordinary transformations. And that one of the things that people who are depressed often lose, which relates to the question I was just asked, is a sense of structure in their lives. And I think many of the alternative treatments provide a kind of structure, which is not simply intellectual or spiritual or emotional, but all of those things, but also a pragmatic structure of practices and things that are done in a sequence in which they're done. The specific things can be helpful, and the simple fact of having an agenda of things to do can be very helpful. So I've seen, and there's always that conversation, or at least there's often that conversation about whether alternative treatments are as effective as other treatments for various more obviously physical illnesses, and that's done through a variety of comparative studies. But I feel that if I see someone who says, I was depressed and now I'm meditating and I'm not depressed anymore, I don't say to them, but you're still really depressed, you still really need medication, in the way that people often do about cancer, for example, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And what influences how you feel, and what influences how the other people in the audience feel, and what influences how I feel. We're all influenced by different things. The trick is finding the thing or the things or those among the many things that will work for you that you're going to adhere to and holding fast to it. Yes?
I find your book not only full of wisdom, but beautifully expressed.
Thank you.
I would love to hear your thoughts on creativity and depression. Hasse, Anthony Storr's work on autistic genius, for example, and manic depression.
There is a kind of cliche which I don't entirely hold with, which is that depression is somehow supposed to be a creative state. I don't think depression is a creative state. I think that hypomania, the sort of gentler mania that comes for some people who have bipolar disorder, is an incredibly creative state. And I think there are some people who spend their entire lives in a state of hypomania, and it's what fuels them and gets them through, and they do great things. What I think about depression is that while you're in it, it's a barren, useless, empty, hollow experience. But after you've been in it for a certain length of time and come out of it, the fact that you went through it will cause you to engage in introspection, which can be tremendously creative. So obviously, it turned out to be creative for me, having the depression. And I think it does often for other people, but only after the fact, not while they're in it. And this idea that the suffering artist is somehow going to produce the most beautiful work in the throes of what I think really is an illness, that is a misguided idea. The insight comes later. So, yes.
Hi. I've had a history of depression, bipolar and all. It's been like almost over 20 years since when I'm dealing with this. And I've come across a lot of people who tell me that it's weakness in character. It's probably the way I perceive things that are not correct. I could be lazy, or I just have a sad point of view. So is depression all about that, or is it something biological? Because I don't seem to be, I mean, even when I read something that's motivating, it may last for a bit, but I tend to go down, I tend to slack after a bit. So what is this that happens? I can't seem to explain it to myself or my friends. And I mean, obviously then judgments are made around that. So.
The question, as I'll construe it, is really about the biological and social and how they relate to each other in the experience of depression. And I would say that in the first place we do something very naive when we say some depression is biological and some depression is social, and it's all one condition, and there are many ways to describe it. And there is doubtless a possibility of someone, when we get to be more sophisticated, who can use biology to see how well educated you are, that you speak English, all of these other things are somewhere in the brain. They don't exist, nothing exists entirely apart from biological reality. But there is also the sense that some people have depression that descends out of nowhere. I think we now see that the depressive brain goes through cycles. It goes through periods when it's dysregulated. It goes through periods when it's not functioning as well in certain areas. And we experience those things experientially, but they also have a basis in biology. But I think it can be very difficult. It goes back to this thing of my saying it was ludicrous not being able to make lunch for myself. And there is this thing that people really find it very difficult to understand how profound and encompassing that sense of paralysis and aloneness can be. And it is something that just comes through in waves. It's certainly not a matter of weakness of character. And it's not, I think, it's not subject to one simply disciplining oneself into getting better. Having said that, I think one does also have to exercise self-discipline in choosing a meditative practice, in deciding to take medication, in doing anything else that one might do in going through psychotherapy. One also has to be fighting back oneself to the best of one's ability. But the best of one's ability is itself in constant flux. And people who say to you, the best of my ability is better than the best of your ability, really have no right to judge what you can do. Only you can know what you're able to do. So I think it takes fighting, it takes vigilance, it takes energy, but it certainly is not just a question of character. It's a question of both, and whether it's a biology that's come out of nowhere or whether it's a biology that's triggered by a great experience of loss or trauma doesn't really matter. There's something that's getting in the way of it. Nobody really likes being depressed. There are some people who find meaning in it, but nobody really likes it. You can make a fairly safe assumption that if someone is depressed and not functioning, it's not because that's what they feel like doing. Yes?
The lady before asked about how one can spot signs of depression, and I guess my question is a bit different. I have several very close friends who are very depressed and found it very difficult to draw boundaries between my own life and their life and not become a crutch for them. I was wondering if you had any tips on how one can be a good friend to someone who is depressed without it having a very detrimental impact on one's own life as well.
So I would say first about becoming a crutch to someone who's depressed. Someone who's depressed is broken and they may need a crutch. So you shouldn't feel bad and as though you sort of haven't set the boundaries well in terms of what effect it has for them. But you do need, of course, to preserve your own sanity and to decide what it is that you're able to do for you. I often find that it's very useful to define time with people who are depressed, to say, you know, I'm going to check in with you every day, but I really can't talk for more than half an hour or so, to be kind of metering out of your own time and your own energy, because actually if you get to the point at which you just can't cope with it at all, that will be much more devastating for them than setting those boundaries as you go along will be. So I think you just have to be quite clear about it and attempt as much as you can to be sympathetic with what's happening to them, to be empathetic enough to understand what's really going on. But depression can have elements of contagion for people who immerse themselves in it completely, and it's important, I think, to be self-protective in those contexts. But it's possible to be self-protective and explain that that's what you're doing, rather than doing it in a way that feels rejecting. I think making someone who's depressed feel as though you just don't want to see them anymore because you can't deal with them and you don't really like them any longer, which is a point to which depressed people often lead, can be very disruptive. So it has to be done cautiously. So, yes, a man with a question. Good.
Hi, I'm Hemant. I just like a yes and a no. Can somebody who is absolutely, you can say the guy with a positive attitude, can he be depressed?
Yes. It's amazing the people who get ambushed by depression, and it's amazing how many people one meets who appear to have a positive attitude and who also have had at least periods of depression, or who are masking their depression with a positive attitude. So you can have a positive attitude and still experience loss and despair. I'm pretty positive myself when I'm not depressed, but it happens from time to time. I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. We'll do the two of you. The last one? Okay. Well, come and talk to me afterwards. Sorry, did you have one?
Yeah, firstly, just to acknowledge the strength which it takes for someone with a mental health background, having been through those problems, to stand up and take on the problems of other people. So by writing the book and receiving all those thousands of letters, just to say, well, it's an amazing achievement.
Thank you.
My question relates to the comment you made at the start of your talk, which you didn't really go back to. I think you called it the middle-class image of depression that it has in some Western countries. I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, and perhaps about the impossibility of receiving treatment for a lot of people who don't have access to such things as, say, private health insurance.
Right. So I think it's suddenly growing dark. Perhaps that's just it. I think in talking about the issue of the impoverished woman whom I described, and I've got a whole chapter on depression among people without economic advantages, I was trying to look at that. In the United States and in much of Western Europe, we have a system now in which people who feel depressed and who are relatively privileged are able to go and seek treatment and find it. But you have to identify yourself as requiring treatment and go and seek it. Many people who are less advantaged don't have the wherewithal or the knowledge or whatever else it would take to go and make that quest and to go and find out what the problem is. And what we need for people in that situation are better access to treatment and more aggressive programs of outreach to identify those populations. Some people have said depression is something that only happens when you have privilege and you have time and you have money, and then you have the room for this sort of luxurious existential problem. But actually, depression is something, the potential for which lies in a large part of humanity. It tends to be triggered by difficulty and stress, and the difficulty and stress of impoverished lives is actually greater than the difficulty and stress of middle-class lives. And so those populations really need treatment, and we do ourselves both a humanitarian and an economic disservice when we fail to offer treatment more broadly to more of the people who require it, whatever form that treatment may take, all the way in the range from the alternative to the medical. I think that's it, but thank you very, very much.